to have him present as part of the Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research Speaker Series. We at the law school get to have a pick for one person for that speaker series. And when I was asked if I can recommend anyone, it was obvious to me that I'm going to recommend Russell, who is a person whose research I've been reading for a very long time. Sorry, we're not recording, so just everyone be warned that we started the recording. Someone I've been following for a very long time and have had the opportunity to also academically disagree with and have an interesting intellectual exchange. Russell is a senior lecturer in international law at the University of Sheffield in the United Kingdom. He is the author of International Law and the Construction of Liberal Peace from 2013 and Cyber Espionage and International Law from 2018. And he's also the co-author of Regulating the Use of Force in International Law, Stability and Change from 2021. And on top of these books, he's also an author or co-author of many journal articles and book chapters on topics of international law. I will also plug in that Russell and I are co-editing a book for NATO's Cybersecurity Centers, the CCDCOE, on the application of the rights of privacy and data protection in times of armed conflict, which will be published next year in Tallinn as part of the CyCon 2022. But that's it. From here on out, I'll leave it to Russell, who will talk to us about his paper, Live and Let Spy, Cyber Espionage in International Relations and International Law.
Well, thank you very much, Azaf. It's a shame I can't be there in person, but I'm still pleased to be here or there remotely. Thanks also to Indiana University and to the Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research and to the Maurer School of Law for their very kind invitation to be here today. It seems that Indiana University is really becoming an academic powerhouse for cybersecurity research, so I'm privileged to be in your company. I'll speak for about 30 to 35 minutes. I want to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end. And as you can see, the main topic of my paper is on cyber espionage. Now, I'm an international lawyer, so of course I'm going to discuss the international legal aspects of cyber espionage, but I have a wider interest in international relations. I will try to situate my legal discussions within a broader political context, within the puzzles and processes of international relations, and hopefully that will appeal to the various constituencies that there are in the audience. There are certain paradoxes and myths in any legal system, and this is particularly the case in international law. International law is pervaded by certain paradoxes and certain myths. This is because of the history of international relations, the history of international law, the development of international relations and the development of international law, but also the structure of the world order. There are many things I could say here, but I think the decentralized nature of the world order gives rise to many of these paradoxes and myths. And I think in the context of international law, perhaps the most acute paradoxes and the most acute myths are found in the context of intelligence. And today, my objective is to expose these paradoxes and to debunk some of these myths. So let me move to my first slide. So I'd like to call out two particular paradoxes as I see pervading the discussion, the international legal discussion on intelligence. Let me just say a couple of definitional words here. I say intelligence, of course intelligence is a broad term and there can be different means and methods for collecting intelligence. And I think perhaps most importantly, intelligence can be collected from different sources. Open source intelligence, which at least for the international lawyers is fairly legally unproblematic because the owner of that information has made it publicly available, has consented to it being accessed, and in fact, may even put it in the public domain, hoping that others will access it. But of course, intelligence can also be collected from closed sources. And this is legally problematic because, of course, the owner of that information seeks to keep it private and confidential. It can keep that information under lock and key. So to say, it can classify that information under national law. It can hide that information behind firewalls, anti-intrusion software. It can encrypt that data. And as I say, generally try to keep that information private and confidential. So in this paper, even though I might use the term intelligence quite broadly, what I really mean is espionage and how international law applies to espionage, and particularly when that espionage is cyber enabled. So let's move on to identifying these paradoxes then. Just to give a little bit of context, what I'd like to say, first of all, is that espionage dates back to time immemorial. We can find references and reports of espionage in ancient Greece, in ancient Rome, even in the Bible, and through to the modern day, espionage has been a permanent feature of international relations. And espionage generally has developed in step with technological innovation. As states manage to explore the high seas, the skies, outer space, we see spy planes being developed, we see spy satellites being developed. And of course, with the advent of cyberspace, we see espionage migrating online and cyberspace being exploited for the purposes of espionage. And the frequency of espionage in cyberspace, I think, has grown exponentially because of the particular features of cyberspace. It's used to store a huge amount of confidential data. That data can be accessed remotely. Cyberspace is an anonymous domain. All of these types of things. But also in cyberspace, espionage is metastatized. So it's now no longer just states conducting national security espionage against other states, but states are now conducting economic cyber espionage against states. They are collecting trade secrets belonging to foreign companies, and also private actors, for example, foreign companies, are exploiting cyberspace to access trade secrets held by their foreign competitors. So the point I'm really trying to make there is espionage is a prominent feature of international relations, and is also a pervasive feature. On the other side of the coin, I think it's also apparent that espionage runs into conflict with certain core values of the international society. I think we can disagree about lots of things, how international society looks, but if we look to the cornerstones of the international society, the building blocks of the world order, I think we could coalesce and agree that the principle of the sovereign equality of states is one of the constitutional principles of the international society, and its corollary, which is non-interference, that states can regulate or determine their internal affairs free from external intervention. So if you put these factors into context, we have a very wide-ranging, pervasive, permanent practice, espionage, that runs into conflict with core values of the international society. And in light of that, I think what's startling, the two paradoxes that I want to identify, is first of all, that states have failed to develop an international law of intelligence. The of is really important there, because I'm going to come back to an international law on intelligence a little bit later. But what I really mean here is that states have failed to develop what we'd call in international a lex specialis, a specialized law of intelligence, or at least to the extent that states have developed, for example, a law of war, a law of armed conflict, international environmental law, the law of the sea, international economic law, international trade law, and so on and so forth. Now, there is a slight caveat here, and I looked at Asaf particularly because I know we disagree on this, but I would concede a certain amount here and say, and I'll come back to this later as well, Asaf. Since 2013, the Snowden revelations, there has been this flurry of state practice around intelligence and even espionage, perhaps, and we may see the kind of the sort of embryonic grass shoots emergence of an international law of intelligence. But really, the failure of states to develop a mature, sophisticated, cohesive, coherent international law of intelligence to date, I think, is quite startling, and I think is a paradox, given how widespread espionage is within international relations and has been. My second paradox that I'd like to identify is that even if we move away from why states have or perhaps have not done certain things with regard to intelligence, why have international lawyers not addressed more intensively and in a more sustained manner the relationship between intelligence and espionage and international law? Again, I looked at Asaf here for confirmation, but there really is only a handful of books and articles and scholarly contributions on the international law of intelligence or the international law of espionage. This is very surprising given how widespread espionage is and the fact that it runs into these core values of the international society. As I say, post 2013, there has been more scholarship on this topic, and myself and Azab, I think, have contributed quite centrally to that. But still, I think we can agree that it's quite unusual, it's quite remarkable, to use the words of another scholar, that there's so little international law literature on intelligence and in particular espionage. Now, this moves me then on to the myths, and I'm going to identify two myths which I think power these or drive these paradoxes. And it's these two myths that I'm going to look to dispel or debunk as we move forward through this, the remainder of this presentation. I might put these in rather stark terms, and as I come back in my conclusion, I might nuance and soften some of my claims, but I really kind of want to make the arguments quite overt, because I think it will make it easier to get our hands around the nature of these myths and the prevalence of these myths and the importance of these myths to these discussions around intelligence and espionage. The first is this uncritical acceptance that espionage is a force for good, that espionage is beneficial to the maintenance of peace and security. I'll come back to explain that in a little bit more in a moment, but let me first identify the second myth, which leads quite naturally on from the first. If you accept the idea that espionage is a force for good, then the second myth that you encounter, pushed forward really by international lawyers, is that international law does not regulate espionage. As a beneficial feature of international relations, international law does not attempt to regulate or constrain this activity. In the words of one scholar, espionage is an international law free for all. So I'm going to work my way through these myths and try to debunk them is perhaps a little strong, but at least challenge them and offer alternative accounts. So let's look first of all at myth one, which is really where my presentation takes on its international relations focus. I mean, the justification for espionage really isn't particularly complex. The justification for espionage is rooted in classic realist theory, that because international relations or the world order of the international society does not possess an overarching world authority, states live in a kind of a Hobbesian state of nature where they're in this permanent security complex, and they're constantly looking to identify threats, balance threats, counter threats, challenge threats, develop their own power, economic power, military power, form alliances with other states in order to balance opposing states or opposing alliances. So, this is really a classic realist environment in which states operate. Other realists refer to this as states being as kind of opaque billiard balls that crash into each other and can have this potentially destructive interactions. Now, in this environment, then it's perfectly normal and quite acceptable, and even perhaps even obligation upon states to try to ascertain what other actors within the world order are doing, to identify threats, to identify the capabilities of other states, where those capabilities are going to be used, how states are voting in international organizations, with which other states are states aligning. So, knowledge is power. Espionage allows for power to be ascertained, and therefore espionage can be seen as essential to the protection of national security, and is therefore justified on that basis. More broadly, the realist approach to international relations is about trying to secure a balance of power at the international level, that no state is more powerful than another one, they balance each other out, and international peace and security is maintained. So if we subscribe to this realist view of international relations, I think the arguments in favor of espionage and cyber espionage become very compelling. My argument, however, is that perhaps realism was at one point in time an accurate explanatory framework for understanding international relations, that it no longer provides a compelling account of how states interact with each other. In fact, this realist world order, this state of nature, has been replaced by an international society that's based upon legalism and is heavily institutionalized. And as I've said already, the constitutional principles of this international society are the sovereign equality of states and their right to non-interference, their right to determine their political, legal, cultural affairs free from any interference from any other actors. So in this sense, international peace and security is maintained within the international society because no state can intervene in each other's internal affairs. Now, if we realize that espionage is about collecting information belonging to another actor without their consent, and information that they've sought to keep private and confidential, then suddenly we realize that espionage is an intrusive activity, that it runs into conflict with the principle of sovereign equality, that it interferes in the internal affairs of other states, and thus can disrupt the peaceful cooperation of states, and can disrupt the maintenance of international peace and security. And this is particularly so in the cyber context, because as I've already alluded to a few moments ago, cyber espionage, because of the exceptional features of cyberspace, these threats are really enhanced and hyperized because of the massive confidential data in cyberspace, because of the anonymous features of cyberspace. And even if a state can identify a foreign actor and attribute responsibility to that foreign actor for espionage, the chances that that state could exercise its criminal jurisdiction, for example, over those actors is practically zero. So cyber espionage becomes almost a risk-free activity, and when it's conducted on this massive scale, then the threat to peace and security, I think, really comes into focus. If you look at some of the famous espionage or cyber espionage incidents, we can think back to the Gary Powers incidents in 1960. I won't go in that too much detail, but perhaps some of you will be aware of it. It caused quite significant diplomatic fallouts between the US and the USSR, leading to deterioration in their relations after a US spy plane was shot down over the Soviet Union. Moving forward into the cyber context, we see the Biden administration admonishing the SolarWinds and the Microsoft Exchange hacks in recent years. I think President Biden referred to them as reckless. I think some US politicians, one US senator, I think, referred to it as an act of war, which I think is completely wrong, but it does give you a glimpse into the disruptive impact that cyber espionage operations can have upon cordial, close, cooperative, collaborative international relations. And perhaps this may be an area where international law would want to regulate. Let's just say a few words about economic espionage, and particularly economic cyber espionage, because states don't just collect information on other states in a kind of a classic national security sense, what would usually refer to as political espionage. States are also increasingly exploiting cyberspace in order to acquire trade secrets and other confidential business information belonging to, well, it may be other states, if those states own certain companies, or it may be private companies within other states. Now, bearing in mind that I think we would all agree that a state's national security hinges upon its economic security, and the fact that economic espionage can have, just to take a step back, that companies are critical to maintaining the economic security of a state, and thus the national security of a state. It's not particularly complicated. Companies create jobs, they attract investment, they pay taxes. So companies are really the lifeblood for the economic security of most states, and thus the national security of states is hinged upon the economic success of their companies. And there's no doubt about it that economic cyber espionage undermines the performance of these companies, it undercuts their research and design, it discourages innovation, it blunts their competitive edge, and it can also even have kind of secondary or tertiary effects. Companies often need to pay higher insurance premiums if they've been subject to a hack or malicious cyber activity. So the costs can really accrue. And I think this is reflected in some of the reports that states are releasing. I mean, the US has been pretty good at this, actually, and almost year on year, it's been explaining and giving indications of costs to the US economy of economic cyber espionage. And most recently, the US said that Chinese economic cyber espionage alone is costing the US up to 600 billion a year. The UK has recently come out and said that economic cyber espionage is a threat to its national security. So again, I think we have in the economic espionage or the economic cyber espionage context, another compelling justification for why this activity should be seen as a threat to national security, but also, you know, when a state's national security is undermined, this affects the maintenance of international peace and security. It can affect productive and healthy international economic relations. And perhaps this is an area of international activity that international law should be regulating, or at least constraining. But this moves me on to myth 2. If you look to the majority of international legal scholarship on espionage, certainly before 2013, but perhaps even after 2013, so the critical moment there is the Snowden revelations, you will find that the majority, or perhaps even the overwhelming majority of commentators are still determining that international law simply does not regulate espionage. As I will recognize these quotations, Gary Brown has recently said that international law is silent on cyber espionage. Richard Falk, many decades ago, very famous international lawyer, said that international law is remarkably oblivious to espionage. Ashley Deeks, post 2013, has said that international law is agnostic to espionage and cyber espionage. And my favorite, and I'm perhaps as I would agree, was John Radson, writing in 2007 in the Michigan Journal of International Law, was a former senior intelligence officer in the US, said that espionage is beyond the law and that international lawyers should move forward and onto other projects with grace. So I think this really captures that, you know, another commentator has also said that, I forget the name now, that espionage and international law are ships that pass in the night, never to meet. So I think it really captures the conscious unwillingness of these commentators to seriously consider how international law applies to what hopefully I've just sold to you is potentially a disruptive international practice. Now, to a certain extent, you know, these commentators are right that there is, as I've said already, there's no international law of intelligence and thus international law of espionage, but there is international law on intelligence and international law on espionage and thus on cyber espionage. If you're prepared to look closely enough, you will find certain rules and regimes of international law scattered across the international legal order that can potentially be harnessed or called upon to regulate espionage and when it's cyber enabled. Diplomatic and consular law, for example, clearly says a lot about whether a state can spy upon a diplomatic premises, or whether a diplomatic post can spy upon their host state. International human rights law has a lot to say about privacy, which then is about surveillance and espionage. The law of the sea, for example, also says a lot about whether ships can engage in espionage whilst passing through the territorial seas of another state, whether or not it can be classified as innocent passage. Some scholars, I think perhaps Azaf would be one of them, may even say that there are specific customary rules that are being developed or have developed that regulate espionage and so cyber espionage. So, you know, I think we, you know, it's a kind of in this was post-ontological era where we need to move beyond these questions of does international law as a discipline apply to this activity, accept that it does, and try to figure out the extent of their interaction. Now, I would like to look today just at the principle of territorial sovereignty. I'll do it very briefly because, you know, my views on this are well known, but the reason I just want to shine a light on territorial sovereignty is because, unlike those other regimes that I've just identified, diplomatic law, law of the sea, human rights law, territorial sovereignty is what we'd refer to as a general principle, or call a general principle of international law. And I think if we are looking to a certain amount of protection from cyber espionage, then perhaps our hopes should be pinned upon this more general principle. I'm going to go through this quite briefly. Happy to pick this up in questions if members of the audience would like, because I'd like to leave some time for more far wide-ranging conclusions. The reason I think territorial sovereignty is so important, because in my view, it's clearly a legal rule, a legal principle of international law. and sovereignty protects the legal personality of a state. The way I see it, the way I explain to my students, is that states have both a body and a mind. The body is the physicality, the territory, the airspace, the territorial waters, and the mind is, the decision-making capacity, the ability to perform certain governmental functions free from interference. If we look at the physicality of the state, it's been held by various international courts and tribunals, not least the International Court of Justice in the Nicaragua case, that any non-consensual trespass into a state's territory, in this instance, it was a spy plane going into Nicaragua's territorial airspace, breached Nicaragua's territorial sovereignty on the basis of non-consensual penetration into its territory. And I think the jurisprudence, not just the International Court, but of many courts and tribunals, and also the practice of many states, would support both that territorial sovereignty is a legal principle and that it's breached on when there's any non-consensual trespass into its territory. Also, territorial sovereignty applies to the cyber domain. And again, we have now a fair amount of practice in favor of that. I mean, I use here cautiously the Italian manual because it's not state practice, but it is an influential document that, in fact, Rule 1 of the manual, so the whole manual is built upon Rule 1, which explains that states exercise territorial sovereignty over the cyber infrastructure that's located within their territory, and that this includes the networks and systems supported by that infrastructure. And fairly similar views, I think, are taken by the GGE reports, but also in state practice. As I said, post-2013, perhaps before then, but recently, there has been a flurry of cybersecurity statements by states that confirm that states exercise territorial sovereignty over the cyber infrastructure and thus the networks and systems that that infrastructure supports when that cyber infrastructure is located within its territory. So the critical question then in the context of cyber is, when is sovereignty breached by a cyber operation, and specifically a cyber espionage operation? Well, there are different views. One view says that it's only where that cyber operation gives rise to certain minimum effects on the cyber infrastructure of another state, that cyber sovereignty is breached. And this is the view of the majority of the Italian manual experts, but also by a number of states. And the general view of those falling into this category, the proponents of this de minimis approach to cyber sovereignty, is that cyber espionage would fall below the threshold for a violation. And actually, New Zealand has been very clear in its cybersecurity statement that cyber espionage does not give rise to sufficiently serious effects to trigger a breach of this principle. The opposite view, which would be my view, is that that any non-consensual penetration into a state's cyberspace would give rise to a violation, and that this would also include cyber espionage operations. Moving beyond the cyber espionage, at least in the context of any cyber operation that penetrates another state's cyber infrastructure, that this is a breach of cyber sovereignty, has been confirmed by a number of states: France, Switzerland, Iran, China, amongst others. So I spoke to Asaf about this the other day when we were in Berlin organizing the conference. My view is that any cyber operation without consent that penetrates another state's cyber infrastructure is violative of the principle of territorial sovereignty, in the same way that that principle applies in the physical context. And this would therefore prohibit cyber espionage operations. As I said to Asaf the other day, perhaps really state practice is still developing. It's still, it's still waxing and waning, as it does in international. These things take time to resolve themselves, and perhaps we'll look to state practice in the future. But at least from a more normative perspective, my view is that the principle of territorial sovereignty should protect a state's sovereign cyberspace to the same extent that it protects a state's sovereign territory. And the reason for that is because if you go down this effects-based approach, it complexifies and subjectifies the principle, of territorial sovereignty. And how do we then decide which cyber operations breach this principle, and in particular, which cyber espionage operations breach this principle? It seemed to me that the SolarWinds and the Microsoft Exchange hacks were considered unacceptable, and perhaps some may say that those are the types of reckless cyber espionage operations that should breach cyber sovereignty, but perhaps other cyber espionage operations don't rise to that level and therefore dip under the threshold for a breach. I find this to be a very unstable basis upon which to build international law. And of course, cyber is now critically important to states. It's indispensable to their effective functioning. So why should a state's sovereign physical territory, for example, its territorial airspace in Nicaragua, be conferred more protection than its sovereign cyber infrastructure? So I just want to make a few concluding remarks here, because I'd like to pull everything together and then project a little bit into the future and make some more wide-ranging remarks. Some of you may think that my views, the core claims that I've made are a bit stark, that they're a bit shrill, that they're a bit overstated, and you know, we can come back to that in questions and discussions. But what I'd really like to say is that for me, as a general matter, espionage as this intrusive activity has the potential to disrupt the maintenance of international relations. Of course, there are circumstances, exceptional circumstances, where espionage is necessary to promote international peace and security. Figuring out when a hostile actor is about to launch a massive armed attack within your territory, surely it's justified to be able to conduct espionage against them. And you know, this is particularly in the case of international terrorism. And you know, you can think of other scenarios where espionage should be seen as a legitimate and lawful state activity. But rather than go down Radson's routes, which is that espionage is just completely outside of the bounds of international law and is therefore an international law free-for-all, my view is that we should integrate espionage into the machinery, into the architecture of international law, and move forward on that basis. Because if states want to collect intelligence on other actors in the world order, they have multiple mechanisms to allow them to do it. But if states look to the existing literature, that literature does not signpost them and guide them to these mechanisms, because, as I say, you know, there's this myth that espionage is simply beyond the boundaries of international law. So if states want to collect intelligence, they can often establish this or embed it within certain treaties. There are multiple treaties that have been concluded whereby states can collect intelligence on other states' parties. The Open Skies Treaty, I think, is perhaps the most obvious example, where states can fly within the sovereignty of other states in order to ensure that they're complying with certain arms control provisions. International organizations such as the Security Council can authorize intelligence operations. Think about the weapons inspection regime against Iraq during the 1990s and the early 2000s, all authorized by way of Security Council resolution. Now, you might think, well, it's wildly unrealistic that certain states are going to enter these treaties. This, you know, it may be that the Security Council is never going to authorize intelligence collection. But even then, there are other rules of international law that can justify espionage operations. I've alluded to this already, but if states are really saying we need to be able to conduct espionage in certain circumstances to confront threats of armed attacks, to confront terrorist groups, then they can go down the route of self-defense, which is subject to very strict conditions, but is that provision of international law that allows states to defend its national security interests. There are others, I don't want to labor over them, but another one is necessity. And the beauty of necessity, which would allow states to conduct espionage, is that it's about general dangers within international relations existing that threaten a particular state's essential security interests and allow that state to act in a way that is non-compliant with international because of the exigencies of the situation. You could think of multiple circumstances where necessity could be harnessed there to justify espionage and cyber espionage activities. And finally, and I'll leave it here, and I think this is where I intersect a little bit more with Asaf's work, is that within certain rules, or perhaps even separate rules can be developed, that recognize that there are certain types of espionage and thus cyber espionage operations that should be lawful under certain circumstances. So political espionage should be lawful, but economic espionage should be unlawful. Or, and I have not put words in Asaf's mouth here, but Asaf may look at it through the lens of proportionality, that there are some espionage operations that are proportionate to the objective of achieving national security and therefore should be lawful. But there are some espionage operations, SolarWinds, Microsoft Exchange, that pursue malicious objectives or are disproportionate in the way in which they go about them, and therefore don't serve the function of peace and security, or dare I say world public order, and therefore they should be prohibited. And I will finish on this point. If states want to do that, if states want to create these rules, the rules are there for them. If they want to change the rules, they can change the rules. States are the masters of international law. They make international law, they break international law, they remake international law, and they enforce international law. But what's critical is that states start talking openly about their intelligence activities, not the specifics of the operations, they're never going to do that, but at a general level, in the same way they talk about use of force issues or armed conflict issues, in order to have a proper discussion about how espionage can be accommodated within the framework of international. Thank you very much. I'd welcome any questions that you have.
So I can monitor the queue, and I'll do. So I'll first use. I will say that I will use my moderator privilege as the first question. But I will invite anyone who's interested in asking a question to just raise your hand using the yellow hand raising function, and I will call upon you. So Russell, I want to start by saying that this is the first time I've seen a presentation from you that kind of in post my writing that addresses some of my writing, and I will say that I'm glad to see that we're coming closer and closer together, because I did relate to a lot of what you said. But it was also the first presentation from you that incorporated international relations theory, and so one of my first questions, just because I'm itching to ask it, is whether or not you're telling a too narrow of a story about the only way to justify espionage is through a realist account. And whether it is not also the case, I know you mentioned at the end that there could be justifications for certain kind of espionage in, quote, exceptional circumstances. But cannot there be both a liberal account and a constructivist account of espionage that is far more pervasive than just in the exceptional circumstances? And one example that I forget who wrote it, but it was a great article from 1990s where they try to build on institutional peace theory, which is a sub-theory within liberal thought, which says that, which focuses on the need to sustain cooperation in anarchy. And one of the arguments made there is that the only way to achieve riskier treaties, to get parties who don't necessarily agree to join a treaty that might harm them in the short run, but benefit all in the long run, is if they have intelligence tools which will allow them to determine in real time whether anyone is trying to flake or breach or violate. And so in that sense, intelligence enhances the core functions of liberal thought around cooperation within the international community. I'd just be curious to hear how you conceptualize that. And I'll end with a second example of that, which is intelligence cooperation. So yet another way by which intelligence might enhance liberal structures, in particular institutional peace, is through getting a lot of countries together to continuously cooperate, even in times where their diplomatic relations might stray, by ensuring that there's a sustained intelligence cooperation that kind of provides some mechanisms. And Israel has been a key example of that in collaborating through intelligence framework, through the Mossad, with countries who might not even acknowledge existence. So I'm just curious to hear about your thoughts on that.
Okay, thank you. I'll address those two comments. Yeah, I think we discussed privately, a couple of weeks ago, but perhaps it's also a conversation that's been had between our work. If you read them side by side, is that post 2013, I think actually you used the phrase Groshan moment in your just security post a while ago, that, that perhaps there are Groshan moments in the intelligence debate. And for the non-international lawyers in the room, Groshan moments really means these kind of critically catalytic moments where something seriously changes and we see legal developments. And post 2013, I think we have seen these quite substantial developments, and states are talking at a general level more openly about their intelligence activities. Take, for example, New Zealand. Go and read the cybersecurity statement. It talks about espionage and cyber espionage, specifically using that language. And if the product of those statements by states, those conversations of states, is to go down a different path, to construct new international law, to create exceptions to existing principles, or whatever it is, then we may see a different legal assessment of espionage and of cyber espionage. And I know that you've put forward particular views in your own work, Azaf, and to a certain extent, it seems that those views are now being seeping into state practice. And some states are now saying that there are certain espionage operations that are okay, and there are others that aren't. The really good example there is economic espionage as opposed to political espionage. And perhaps those categories and that typology is going to become even more complicated, or not complicated, but more finessed as we move forward. But states will take the lead on that, and hopefully our work can be useful for that. But what I'd really want to say is that I'm not wedded to a particular view. If states want to come out and I will work with the the state.
I just want to push you just a little bit, because this is the discussion we've always had. What I'm trying to get you to say more about, because you started with Hobbes today, is what is not necessarily where post 2013 law might evolve and state practice might shift and so on, but rather how do you theorize the function of intelligence in international relations? Okay.
Yeah,
just on that point.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I understand what you say about if a state is able to understand whether another state is complying with its legal obligations. If it finds out that it's complying, then trust will emerge, and then they can develop functionally new legal regimes across different areas. But for me, I go back to the inherent nature of espionage. If in order to figure out whether another state is doing X or Y, complying or not complying, you have to penetrate its computer networks or systems in order to take that information, then for me, the backdrop there is still one of animosity, hostility, disruption. And I find the longitudinal effects of that to be quite serious for the international community. It's going to benefit the state doing the espionage, of course it is, but if you see states inhabiting an international community, then I think this type of activity is antithetical to the core notions of sovereignty and non-interference.
Great. As I'm sure you're all seeing, me and Russell, this is precisely the kind of starting point conversations that we differ on. But I don't want to continue to control the discussion. So if there are any questions, please feel free to raise your hand. No, I obviously have 10 more, but so I see Craig.
Yeah, thank you for the discussion. Craig Jackson, I'm a program director at the center. A line of discussion I've seen over maybe the last 10 years is one that describes the sort of militarization of the intelligence community, not just in the States, but around the world, as well as the defense communities leaning more and more and more on their intelligence apparatus. Does that play in any way to your views, Russell?
Yeah, it comes down to to the fact that espionage shouldn't be all lumped together, I think is the critical thing. You know, the espionage serves different purposes, it has different aims, it has different objectives. And, you know, as I say, I mean, you know, states will sort out, you know, which of those activities are acceptable and which of those that aren't. But the pressures imposed on the intelligence community by the military folk, you know, yeah, I mean, it muddies the waters in a way, I guess, as to, you know, what are the aims, what are the objectives of those operations, whose interests are they serving? And, you know, I think then it makes it much more difficult for international lawyers to see, you know, is this a military operation? Is it a covert operation? Is it about, you know, intelligence alone? Is it about, you know, potentially deleting data? Is it about having constant backdoor access to those systems? You know, is it going to be a persistent threat going forward? So, yeah, I mean, for me as an international lawyer, all of these types of factors, you know, cloud the picture or muddy the waters, and it makes it much more difficult to, you know, to ascertain, you know, the legality of espionage, but also to track a path going forward.
Thanks. I really resonate with that. I'm a cybersecurity person. It's difficult for us to think about what we do as distinctly counterintelligence or counter sabotage. I mean, you can look at so many situations and go, well, I'm kind of thinking about both, like all the time. So, and
you know, there has been a militarization of cyberspace generally, and you know, when you militarize a particular domain, the problem with that is all of the attendant consequences, which is, you know, this kind of acute understanding of national security, this need for exceptionalism, and, you know, sometimes, you know, different legal rules apply when the military act as opposed to when the intelligence community act or any other organ of the state acts. And this comes with risks, but it also, as an international, it makes your work much more difficult.
Another thing I'd be curious to hear more from you is your prioritization of territoriality as a guiding principle in a space so complicated and aterritorial as cyberspace. And this kind of touches on what Greg was saying a second ago about drawing lines that are not in the sand. And so another colleague of ours, Craig Forsays, he says that cyber espionage is a legal headache, precisely because of the difficulties in trying to ascertain territorial line drawing. And so one example of that just started your presentation today, where you excluded open source intelligence from your analysis, despite the fact that one can conceptualize different kinds of what is open or closed in a more spectrum sort of way. So is Facebook information, there's now been a big case about the Gambia wanting certain information from Facebook in the context of its investigations against Myanmar and for an ICJ case. Is that data that Facebook removed from its website, is that public or closed? Is that open or closed? How do we conceptualize open and closed as much as how do we conceptualize territorial and out territorial in the extraterritorial cyberspace?
And territoriality is critically important, because there are certain espionage operations that, you know, that won't fall foul of the principle of territorial sovereignty, precisely because, you know, it doesn't interfere or, you know, involve trespass into another state. So I think it's fairly well accepted that spying from outer space, from satellites, you know, is lawful. States regularly rely upon images caught from satellites, and you know, they publicly discuss those. And because it doesn't involve this trespass into territory, it's often considered lawful. We have other cases whereby national courts, but even the European Court of Human Rights has said that passive intelligence collection that doesn't involve stepping into another state, you know, doesn't violate a rule of international law. So territoriality, at least in my framework, suddenly then becomes very important. It's the locus of the espionage, you know, is important. Perhaps in the physical context, that's much more straightforward. In the cyber, which is an aterritorial domain, you know, I can see why, you know, that there are problems there. But I guess it comes back to, and I'd be interested to know what the cybersecurity people would say. I'm sure they know far much more about this than I do. But it's kind of how you understand cyberspace. Is cyberspace purely this virtual domain that exists somewhere that we can't get our hands around? Or actually, is it rooted in some type of physical territoriality, because the internet is supported by this physical infrastructure and architecture? And I think I probably see it in that way. And I think if you see cyberspace rooted in that physicality, then you can start to apply more easily the rules of international, which are, as I've said before, much more based upon territorial notions.
So I see Carol's hand, but I think it's to some extent to say, I want to talk about the physical layer, the cable layer, the server layer is a cop-out for me. And the reason why it's a cop-out is because while that is certainly physical, and that can certainly be territorialized, it is data, which is what is moving, and sometimes at complete randomness along those cables and servers. And trying to capture a moment in a piece of data's life, to try and therefore suggest that it's capturing or interception, becomes the kind that we now territorialize and regulate through where we captured it. That is the problem. Despite the fact that the server might be there, the data might have transferred through that server for no reason other than randomness.
Absolutely. And I think, again, to come back to your previous point about when is data private and confidential, and when is it open and publicly available, I think the same issues in relation to the transiting data. Where is it actually located at the point in time in which it's appropriated? So those questions are obviously very tricky and very difficult. I mean, I guess my work has kind of started from almost a first order basis. That let's just assume that this information is private. Let's say nuclear launch codes. Let's say China hacks into the US and steals its nuclear launch codes, which are housed on a cyber network that's definitely located on US territory. Is that permissible under international? Does that have a benefit for international relations? My answer to both those questions would be no.
Carol.
Hi, thanks. Great discussion. One of the things I want to comment on is that where data is, where information is stored, the data center is important for international law and law. When the Patriot Act was passed, Canadian companies, universities, NGOs who had their data backup in the United States had to immediately change that so that their backups were not stored in the United States. Europeans several years later were shocked to discover that the SWIFT network, which is a European-based network, was in fact backed up in New York, and the United States had access to all of that information. There were problems in the late 90s when, and this was a problem that a lot of corporations had, particularly in Europe. They wanted to process information in another country that was not in the EU. And they discovered that if it was personally identifiable information, that it could not be processed in another country. They wanted to, a specific example was a large human resources management company wanted to process information in Egypt, and that being outside the EU, they were not permitted to do that and had to pay a whole lot more because it had to be processed inside. So the question of where the data actually resides, who has access to it, is the first step in understanding this. It's not just the servers, because any data system can have the service provider, the data center, the managed provider who just looks at whether pings and packets are going back properly, the cybersecurity company, the company that's managing the whole system, who's doing payments. Those can all be in separate countries. And so that's the first thing. But I would also ask you a lot of things that happen in cyberspace. So for example, ransomware is basically a train stick up. Somebody has stopped the train, they're holding them at gunpoint and saying, turn over the gold or we're going to kill you all. And the disruption there ends up being more like a denial of service attack. So it ends up actually being more than a theft. It actually ends up being more like sabotage. And of course, then there is actual sabotage. But so I would make a distinction among spying on folks, which is finding out what they're doing, sabotaging them, but then also theft of intellectual property. And theft of intellectual property is theft. And it's not espionage in the sense that one country spies on another country to find out, is Kim Jong-un actually ill or did he just lose weight? It's more than that. So I wonder, if you're looking sort of at further parameters, where you would go with that using your framework, which is very interesting.
Yeah, thank you for those questions. Yeah, and I think that the US example is very interesting because, of course, the Cloud Act has been passed subsequent to the Microsoft case, which was about whether or not the US could access data in data centers in Ireland. And then, of course, the problems caused by that decision were alleviated or sort of assuaged, I guess, by the Cloud Act. So, yes, I mean, identifying where the data is located does seem to be critical in the discussions around accessing data, the international legal rules that apply. Although I do still take Asaf's point that some of the questions there about data moving very quickly, and also the points that you were making about different actors being involved in handling that data and processing that data and sharing that data, can make a lot of these questions quite complicated, and I would admit would put strain on applying the rules of international law, which are primarily territorially based, and going forward, I think that's something that international lawyers are going to have to confront, whether or not these international laws can accommodate this new domain, and the lightning speed at which data travels, and the fact that data can be split and held in different places simultaneously, and then kind of reform in other areas is perhaps something that international lawyers need to take more seriously. And with the ransomware point, I mean, I find that very interesting because, and this goes back to Craig's question about the militarization of the intelligence community, is that we talk about cyber espionage as if it's this easily identifiable act, that it's this pure acquisition of intelligence, of data in the cyber context. But the reality is that if you break into a network in order to steal that data, then to a certain extent it's sabotage, because you reveal to the world that this network is unsecure, and it's not, it doesn't have integrity. Is that sabotage? Well, it sounds very much like it. If that backdoor is permanently established, or at least indefinitely established, as it was in SolarWinds, then you might think that that's more of an attack. And I think this is why Senator Rubio called it an act of war, because it basically allowed a malicious foreign actor to be constantly present on your network. And then, as you say, there are all kinds of issues there around theft of its intellectual property. Is it cyber crime? Is it ransomware? So suddenly these categories that we're using, that I've used, seem don't paint the full picture, or at least don't capture accurately what's going on. And again, I would happily admit there that perhaps international lawyers need to think more critically about those categories they're using, because different legal rules clearly apply to intelligence operations, to cyber attacks, to acts of cyber war, and to ransomware.
So I'm realizing we're 2 minutes past the hour, so we'll have to stop here. I will note that I got multiple direct messages from people who left already, who said that they really, really thoroughly enjoyed your discussion and the level of your responses. So just wanted to mention that. You can all join me in thanking Russell for coming and for presenting today. And I will also use this opportunity to plug our next speaker, which will be on Thursday, November 11th. Eli Sugarman from Facebook, Facebook's oversight board, will come talk to us. Yet another very controversial, very complex topic, just as much as cyber espionage is. So thank you again, Russell.
And thank you for having me. I've enjoyed myself, and hope to see you all soon physically. Cheerio.
Cheers.